Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our second IMPS Talk. This evening, our guest speaker is long-term IMPS member James Baxter. Welcome, James.
Thank
James
you.
will be talking to us about Ian Fleming and his private army, also known as 30th Assault Unit. So please sit back in your chairs and enjoy the evening. Thank you. Over to you, James.
Thank you, Ross. Good evening, everybody, and welcome. Delighted you can all join me. I will be talking, as Ross says, about Ian Fleming and his private army, also sometimes known as his Red Indians. It's interesting, I spoke to a friend of mine, an IMPS member as well, only a couple of days ago, and he said, well, I've never heard of 30 Assault Unit, so I looked it up on Wikipedia. And I thought, right, okay, that's fine. If he hasn't heard about it, and you haven't heard about it, then you've probably looked it up on Wikipedia as well. In which case, it probably makes this evening's talk rather pointless. Nevertheless, I will continue, and hopefully, in so doing, you will A, learn a little bit more, perhaps, than Wikipedia can offer, and B, if they tell you better than I do, you can test me at the end and criticize my comments and correct me where I've gone wrong. Anyway, there we go. Right. Well, as I said, this evening, we're talking about Ian Fleming's private army. And I think it probably might, yes, okay, it's a warship. Yeah, I know we're a military vehicle club, but we do start this evening with a warship. The reason is that this particular vessel is the motor gunboat Locust, and she was ferrying a number of Royal Marines towards the port of Dieppe on the 19th of August in 1942. These Royal Marines were part of a larger group, and in fact, the total invasion at the time, or the total assault on Dieppe, comprised something like 5,000 troops. And of those 5,000 troops, this very small group of Royal Marines were approaching the coast on this vessel, the Locust, under the smoke of a naval bombardment. The vessel, as it approached, came under a lot of gunfire and took on quite a lot of damage from the German defences. So the Marines on board found themselves in a difficult position of being on board a ship which was taking on a lot of fire. A number of shells had hit the vessel, and she started to list and looked as if she was going to be very heavily damaged. And ultimately, the decision was made to withdraw the vessel because they were not getting any nearer to the coast and the gunfire was becoming too heavy. The purpose of their operation was to get ashore at Dieppe and to tie up alongside the Dieppe quay and get across to the headquarters of the local Kriegsmarine in order to seize documents, code books, and in particular, the German coding machine called Enigma. So the Locust is approaching the Dieppe shore under heavy gunfire, Marines on board, not very happy. The vessel decides to withdraw. The Marines are transferred to another landing craft and are heading off for the beach on the landing craft, but not heading for the quay because it's just not been possible to approach it due to the German gunfire. And at this point, we will leave them because I want to get on to explain to you about Ian Fleming. Ian Fleming was in fact in command of this particular group of Marines, and they were operating in direct instructions from him to enter the port and carry out this operation. But Ian Fleming himself found himself in this position by a rather circuitous route. On the 23rd of May, 1939, he was invited to have lunch with his then boss at the stockbroking firm of Rowe and Pittman to join him and Admiral Aubrey Hugh Smith for lunch at the grill of the Carlton Hotel. His host was Admiral John Godfrey, and Godfrey was the recently appointed Director of Naval Intelligence at the Admiralty, and it was a job interview. Fleming spoke very good French, German, and Russian, not quite so fluently, and he got on very well over the canapés and the main course with Godfrey. Godfrey invited Fleming to become his personal assistant at the Admiralty. So clearly he had passed his interview over the lunch. Fleming was born on the 28th of May in 1908. His father was an MP for Henley and was killed in action in 1917. Fleming went to school at Eton, but was not a particular scholar, although he was very good at athletics and sports. He left to go to Sandhurst and lasted about a year, but decided that the army was not for him. He applied for the Foreign Office, but failed to get in, and eventually found himself working for Reuters as a journalist. And he spent about 2 years with Reuters and also some time with the Times, but principally with Reuters, during which he got a time to visit Moscow, where he learned some of his Russian. He became a stockbroker with Rowe and Pittman, mainly because he needed the money and journalism wasn't paying him enough. I think it was actually to fund his lifestyle, which seemed to be rather exotic even back in the 1930s. One friend described him as the world's worst stockbroker. So one can assume that his interview with Godfrey was probably something of a godsend and got him out of the grind of being a stockbroker. The Naval Intelligence Division was based in London in a place called a building called the Citadel. The Citadel is situated just off Horse Guards Parade, and it's a large concrete building which is still there today, and it housed a significant part of the Admiralty's operation, particularly the intelligence section. His Fleming's new boss, was Admiral Godfrey, who was the director of naval intelligence, and Fleming joined with the rank of lieutenant commander in what was known as the special branch of the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. These are basically administrators and specialists rather than seagoing officers. Because Fleming had no experience of the Navy at all, he was immediately sent on a training course so that he could discover all the traditions and how to salute and other necessities for any upstanding officer and gentleman in the Navy. He gave considerable favour with Godfrey, and Godfrey concluded that he would make a very good assistant. So he got stuck in to the job. Quickly, he started to get involved in intelligence activities in relation to mine warfare, in relation to submarines and torpedoes. Magnetic mines, particularly, as you see on the screen, is a German magnetic mine, and electronic homing torpedoes and other German naval devices which the Royal Navy were trying to counter. As part of his responsibilities was to find and endeavour to obtain information and liaison with the new Bletchley Park code, government code and cipher school. The German cipher machine Enigma was causing a lot of problems with the Navy and indeed British intelligence, in that the Germans had produced a cipher machine which was very effective in coding all their radio messages, and Bletchley Park was endeavouring to crack those codes. In so doing, they were looking for an opportunity to capture as much information about those coding systems, and indeed ideally to get hold of one of these coding machines. So there were one or two exercises and operations which were planned during 1940-41 to try and discover or recover one of these machines, or as much information about them as they could. One of these operations, which was organised by Fleming himself, was a major hill of Naval Intelligence Division, and a bunch of Marines were landed in Iceland, completely breaking Iceland's neutrality, and headed for the German consul to secure as much information as they could. They did not get a machine, but they did get a lot of documentation, which led to a lot of assistance being given to the code breakers in Bletchley Park. In March 1941, there was a commando raid made on the Lofoten Islands in Norway. During the course of that, the Marines managed to capture a vessel, a harbour defence vessel called the Krebs. Now, this was another exercise another operation which Fleming had planned, and indeed was highly successful, because from this they managed to obtain a German Navy Enigma machine And this particular capture was also enhanced by the capture of a weather ship called the Munchen, which also gave up a lot of information, but also another one of these Enigma machines. These operations, which were coordinated by Fleming, proved to be very successful, and Bletchley Park were very impressed with the work that Fleming was doing on their behalf in obtaining the appropriate, as much information as they could about the German Enigma machine. Fleming, clearly feeling successful and somewhat buoyant, actually came up with a new plan. And this was called Operation Ruthless. And the idea that he had was that a captured German bomber would be crashed into the sea and involve the German rescue service in one of their rescue boats coming across to recover the crew. Whereupon the British Royal Air Force Special Services crew would overpower the crew of the rescue boat, and with it obtain documents and indeed, hopefully, an Enigma machine. This particular type of operation was known as a pinch. If they could actually pinch this information and this intelligence, then this would be hugely helpful for Bletchley Park. The plan was approved, and RAF and Navy personnel and Special Services personnel were all allocated for it, and it was all set to go. But unfortunately, the Royal Air Force were unable to find any German rescue boat at sea at an appropriate time. So the mission was in fact aborted. But it is a good example of the sort of exercise, sort of operation that Fleming was involved with when he got into the NID. And that was his main task, or appears to be his main task, is organizing these sort of actions. This particular type of approach, he felt, should be more formalized, rather than just the Navy coming up with these ideas, or the intelligence division coming up with these ideas, talking to the Navy, talking to the Army, trying to get them on board to do these operations. He felt that it would be a good idea if a special operations naval commanded group, perhaps with Marines, could take on responsibility for doing these sort of operations. And he was particularly inspired by a German organization which was called Abwehrtruppen. Now, the Abwehrtruppen were under the command of the German Abwehr, which is the German Secret Service, and they were very well organized in advancing, getting ahead of the German main force, breaking through the front line and going ahead and capturing information, documents, equipment, etc., from their enemies. So particular operations that they were very successful in were in the Balkans, where they captured a lot of information from the Yugoslav army headquarters, and they also broke into Athens ahead of the main German force into Athens, and captured a lot of information from the headquarters of the Greek army. And Fleming was very impressed with this, and it rather convinced him that the idea of having a British alternative should be promoted formally. So he went ahead and wrote a memorandum to his boss suggesting that he introduce a Naval Intelligence Commando unit. And as you can see on the screen, there is the original document that Fleming wrote to his boss, Godfrey. The contents were pretty clear. The idea being that there should be a section which is under the responsibility of the Naval Intelligence Division, and it would obtain a series of targets from the various NID sections, and they would then put together a plan, train a raiding force, and that raiding force would then go in and assault the appropriate target. Surprisingly, it got approval. In fact, it was put before the Chief of Combined Operations, who was Mountbatten, and he entirely approved it. It was just the sort of thing that he wanted to wanted the British services to get involved with. And he approved the operation, and he approved in the introduction of this new organization. But the one thing that was not agreed was that new unit should come under the command of combined operations, it was agreed that it should remain under the command of the Navy intelligence unit. So that meant that in practice, Fleming became the organizer, not quite the commander, but the organizer of this new unit. The name of the unit was initially the Naval Intelligence Commando Unit, and it was fairly quickly changed to a new name, the Intelligence Assault Unit. The first team to be formed under this was split into two. There was the Naval Unit, which comprised 2 Royal Marine officers, 5 NCOs and 10 Marines, and then there was the military section, which was 4 officers, 6 NCOs and 18 other ranks. And they were the ones who comprised the assault unit that was now heading towards the beach at Dieppe. So we go back to the Dieppe operation, and this is the first attempt of the new unit to make a pinch and is already running into difficulties. The landing craft taking the unit across to the beach where the troops were again approaching the beach. They were under heavy gunfire from the German defences, much as the rest of the Canadians who were attacking Dieppe at the time, running into great difficulties. The landing craft was hit, explosion took place, and it started to grind to a halt. It unfortunately caught fire, and ammunition started to explode on board, and the landing craft came to a halt. She was not going to reach the mole. That was for certain. So now we have a situation where neither craft can reach the mole. The Marines on board are in considerable difficulty. Casualties are being taken, and the landing craft is beginning to sink. The commanding officer decides that the operation should be aborted. And at that particular point, another shell hit the landing craft, and the landing craft captain was killed. So the order was given every man to do the best he can. And so the crew literally jumped overboard into the sea, some of them swimming out to sea, hoping to reach the vessels offshore, which were providing the gunfire support. And some of them swam ashore, ultimately to be captured and end up in German prisoner of war camps. However, despite this failure, there was no doubt that the validity of the type of operation that Fleming envisaged was confirmed. And although this particular thing was a failure, that could be put down, if you like, to the fortunes of war, but the planning of the operation and the implementation of the operation up to that point was extremely well done and was remarkably successful. So the Navy went ahead with developing this new assault unit, and they next went off to North Africa for their next major operation. And this involved taking part in the Allied landings in North Africa, and they were heading for Algiers. They were part of the Operation Torch, and they were on board a vessel called HMS Malcolm, which was also taking part with them were US forces. And the plan was that the IAU, or now temporarily called the Special Engineering Unit for security purposes, would land the Marines on another jetty in Algiers harbour, and the Marines would then head off for their target was going to be the French naval headquarters and signals unit, because the French at this stage were the Vichy French in North Africa were under the control of Vichy France, and therefore theoretically allies to the Germans, and they were indeed heavily resisting the Allied landings in North Africa. And so they were, to all intents and purposes, the enemy. This was another occasion where the assault ran into difficulties. The French defenders very badly damaged the Malcolm, forcing her to withdraw. The Marines were then transferred to HMS Bololo, which was the command ship for the operation off Algiers. So the Marines were then transferred and later landed on shore about 12 miles away from Algiers and had to yomp it back to the city, by which time an armistice had been agreed between French forces and the Allies, which meant the Marines were prohibited from searching the French Navy headquarters. So Fleming redirected them to the Italian Armistice Commission, and there they were welcomed. The Italians surrendered very quickly without resistance, and even provided the Marines with a pasta lunch for them. The Marines were very successful in obtaining a lot of useful Italian information about their submarines and their manned torpedoes. So that was deemed to be a fairly successful operation. The IEU found itself chasing around for material in competition with other Allied units who had similar objectives. And this was going to be one of the problems throughout their time, was that they got bogged down with chasing around for intelligence material and to locations which were also targets of other similar Allied units. And there was a certain lack of communication between these various units. Anyway, they then, after the hitting the Italian Armistice Commission, they then went to a villa overlooking the sea, which was the German Armistice Commission. And there they were able to discover an Abwehr Enigma machine, which they purloined and was returned to Bletchley Park. The whole operation was, although quite successful, did actually provide for a number of factors which they need to take into account on future operations. The first one was the fortunes of war. A battle plan seldom survives the first encounter with the enemy. The thoroughness of Fleming's knowledge of targets and pre-planning and changing targets at the last minute was extremely effective. The flexibility of the units on the ground to act as they saw fit, with targets of opportunity, sometimes leading to admonishments from Fleming, but it was also meant that they had flexibility to move around and grab stuff rather than having to be directed from London. And those resulted in some what they called unexpected pinches. And as I say, rivalry from other units was going to be one of their continuing problems. So now move on to a reorganization. And this reorganization involved an expansion of the unit from the small numbers that had gone out to Algiers, and was split into 3 units. There was the unit section number 36, which was the naval and technical section, which had 5 officers and 2 signalmen. And they were the ones who were providing the specialist expertise. Number 33 section was the Royal Marine Troop, which was 2 officers and 20 other ranks. And number 34 section was the Army Troop, which was 5 officers and 20 other ranks. So it's considerably expanded the numbers of people involved with this new unit. They then underwent some significant training. The officers were sent off on burglary, lock pricking, safe breaking, searching of premises, signals intelligence, document recognition courses. And a lot of these skills were provided by Scotland Yard, no doubt with some contact with the underworld. And indeed, I believe one of the members of the unit was an ex-burglar and safe breaker, who was no doubt extremely useful to them. The other ranks went off to do their training in Achnacarry in Scotland, which is where the Royal Marines commandos did most of their training before they went into action. There they were taught street fighting, enemy booby traps, handling explosives, counter demolitions, and recognition of enemy uniforms, badges, etc., as well as the standard commando training. The new unit was now off to North Africa and Sicily, Italy and Yugoslavia. A series of operations. Initially, they moved to Tunisia, where they were issued with their own vehicles for the first time. Up to this point, any vehicles that they'd used on operations had to be nicked from somebody else or captured, but now they were actually issued with staff cars, jeeps, and 1,500-weight trucks of their own. Fleming was quite renowned for obtaining the best stores and the best equipment, and he developed a reputation of providing his Red Indians with as much of the equipment and of the top end equipment which they needed. They then went to operations in Sfax and in Sousse Harbour in Tunisia, which were quite useful and provided good training for them. A brief sojourn to Pantelleria, which harvested little information and intelligence. And then it was on to Sicily as part of Operation Husky. Here they were much more successful and were involved in a pinch, as they called it, at the Trapani naval base on the northwest coast. Here they managed to get a considerable amount of information on, again, Italian naval secrets, particularly the torpedo submarines and manned torpedoes. After that, it was off to Italy. And here the new organization, now named 30 Commando, landed on the island of Capri. They in fact captured the island of Capri and headed off towards the main torpedo factory and midget submarine testing center, where they captured the resident admiral in charge, Admiral Minicini, along with his wife and a considerable amount of her luggage. In fact, they had to take the admiral, leave the wife with her luggage for a time, and then come back and collect her and her luggage because there was so much of it. Subsequent operations in the Bay of Naples found another torpedo depot, a radar station, an Italian Navy communications center. Then it was off to Taranto, which is on the other side of Italy, and there they searched the main naval base in Taranto, where they came across the latest German acoustic sweep, which resulted in modifications being made to Royal Navy mining practice. While operations were taking place in Italy, a small unit went off to Yugoslavia to support the Tito forces. Unfortunately, however, due to politics, they had to withdraw with no benefits being gained. So small missions to the Greek islands were equally unsuccessful. This is where British forces had captured one or two of the Greek islands in an effort to another access into the German occupied Europe. But unfortunately, it was a total disaster. The Germans reoccupied the islands, and the 30 Commando group had to withdraw. So those operations were not particularly successful. Again, these operations in the Mediterranean were reviewed, and the Admiralty decided that it was very pleased with the work that 30 Commando had been doing in the Med, but other lessons had been learned. The first being the need for more specialist officers. The Marines and the Navy officers who were involved at the time did not really have sufficient knowledge about the type of things that they were looking for in the first place. And then once they had captured documents, they weren't very sure what sort of documents were, and in looking at those documents, what were valuable and what not. 2 underwater specialists were recruited, along with 2 civilian scientists who were appointed as a lieutenant and a lieutenant commander and given very short Royal Navy training courses. And they joined the team and were extremely useful when it came to more documentation and equipment pinches. The need for more troops to guard the captured sites and for bigger vehicles to recover the equipment. Better briefings from the Naval Intelligence Division in London with clear priority lists. The problem was the units had no formal communication with HQ, which did present something of a problem. Shortage of transport, leading to too much time spent in repairing the transport they did have. Dispersal of effort was one of the problems. Concentrating on specific high-grade targets would be needed, and not so much swanning around looking for stuff. Discipline and training of Royal Marine troops needed to be significantly improved. They had, while they were in Italy, got something of a reputation for looting and other unsavory activities, and clearly they had been given too much of their head. So more training and better discipline, particularly to be imposed by the officers, was required. The new organization, or under the review, the unit was reorganized into sections with an assault party, a guard party, and a technical specialist party. So as part of this reorganization, the name Special Engineering Unit was dropped, and it now became 30 Assault Unit. And the structure was modified, and now we had a more advanced unit with 2 subdivisions: the Royal Naval Intelligence Section, who did the planning, and that was directly responsible to Ian Fleming, and the Royal Marine Section, which was effectively the heavy mob who did the assaults and did the guarding. The unit now comprised 3 troops, A, B, and X, each of 40 men, and there was an additional HQ troop. And they now received much better equipment and they moved into having Staghound armoured cars, Humber Scout cars, and supporting vehicles. The mobility aspect was actually quite important. And so I managed to dig up some quite an amusing little diagram here on the left, which shows the new 30 Commando with the type of equipment that it was being supplied. And the diagram on the left, which I've obtained from an amusing little website of people who I think they are war gamers, and they have these diagrams. And I thought this was particularly appropriate because obviously they'd investigated the organization structure for 30 Commando, and you can see there the use of Staghound armored cars, Chevrolet armored trucks and Jeeps, and 33-ton trucks. On the right, there's some photographs there of actual 30 assault unit vehicles. There's a nice one of a Staghound, a slightly blurred one of a Humber armored car, the Chevrolet Canadian C15 TA at the bottom with a nice 30 written on it. And on the right, you've got the typical airborne para SAS unit type Jeep with multiple machine guns, which is also used by 30 Commando as well. So they were split now into 3 separate units, and all this was done in preparation for the Normandy landings. Most of them went through the Aknakari training again in preparation, and they were now, as I say, split up into 3 units with particular responsibilities when they hit the beaches in Normandy. The first unit was what's called Pike Force. Now, this is under the command of Geoffrey Pike, and his objective was the radar station at Douve-la-Deliverance. They landed at 8:45 on D-Day morning alongside the Canadians and headed off for the radar station. Unfortunately, the radar station was too heavily defended, and Canadians were unable to break through and get into the radar station. So Pike Force withdrew and joined up with their vehicles, which were being landed by Cut Force, which was led by Dunstan Curtis. Cut Force landed separately, and they landed with the whole of the Commando unit's vehicles. The whole all came in on 2 landing craft. Unfortunately, when none of the landing craft was approaching the beach, the landing ramp went down far too far out, and a lorry drove straight off the end into 10 feet of water. But they managed to get around that and land the rest of the vehicles. Cut Force and Pike Force, they then became one single unit, and they worked their way along the coast up through France and then into the Low Countries. And they were mainly targeted with finding V weapon sites, including the ones at Epelec and La Coupeule, blimey, French is terrible. Both of which, of course, are familiar to a lot of IMPS members who've no doubt been there during various IMPS expeditions to northern France. The other group was Wool Force, and they had a particularly important job. They were responsible for attacking and capturing the German Navy headquarters in or near Cherbourg, and they joined up with the American forces heading up to Cherbourg. The headquarters was in a village just outside Cherbourg and called Octeville. And in Octeville, there was the Villa Meurice, which was the headquarters of the German Navy in that area. And that was their target. It was done in close cooperation with the Americans, and in fact, they had such a joint operation that they both ended up by capturing the headquarters together. And the 30 Commando unit went into the tunnels underneath the villa, where they found a great deal of extremely useful information. There had been a lot of fighting around there, and you can see on these images of the combined American and Commandos working their way through Octeville for getting up to the headquarters itself in the villa. And you see on the top there, they're working their way into the tunnels underneath the villa. On the bottom left-hand side is a photograph of the commanding admiral's conference room and the dining room, which looks rather splendid. And indeed, the whole villa looks rather attractive, which is fairly normal for German headquarters. They usually used to go for the best properties. Fleming visited Wool Force while they were at Cherbourg, and he was normally forbidden to go ashore or indeed to go anywhere near the front line because he became effectively vulnerable to capture. And if he was captured and tortured, undoubtedly he would give away a huge amount of very secret information. So he was not allowed to go anywhere near the front line, but he did manage to visit Woolforce in Cherbourg. Apparently he was not terribly popular with the officers. He had a dispute with Woolforce's commander, Woolley, when he went on his visit, and that seemed to go down particularly well with the men. After the Cherbourg, Woolforce went back and joined up with the other two forces to become the complete 30 Commando for the attack on Paris and the liberation of Paris. By this time, there'd been a new unit formed, which was called the Forward Interrogation Unit, and they acted as interpreters and interrogators. The German-speaking team included a young 23-year-old Captain Charles Wheeler, Royal Marines, who became a distinguished broadcaster, as you probably know, with the BBC and the ITV after the war, and only died fairly recently. So they headed off to Paris, working their way through the countryside, using secondary roads and fields and tracks without encountering any enemy armour. Contact with local resistance units and the FFI was considerably helped by the presence of the FIU and indeed Charles Wheeler. It's interesting, one of the Navy commanders gave a description of how they worked their way down through the country lanes. I led the way with Fraser's Jeep, and the scout cars followed at 25-yard intervals on alternate sides of the road where possible. I preferred the Jeep as the lead vehicle, in spite of its lack of protective armour, because we could easily see clearly in every direction and could reverse or manoeuvre very quickly out of trouble. The officers and sergeant of A Troop managed to get 1,500 Germans manning a radar station to surrender to them on the basis that they were representing a larger force and the station was surrounded by French resistance to whom the Germans did not particularly wish to surrender. So through a bit of guile, they managed to capture some 1,500 men with only about 20 Marines in charge. They then summoned the Americans to take over the Germans from them. 30 AU then drove straight to the Navy headquarters in the Château de la Muette on the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. The Germans spent some 2 hours resisting with a major firefight with casualties on both sides. Eventually they surrendered when 30 AU sent their armoured cars hurtling down the boulevards, firing their cannons at the German headquarters. On this occasion, 500 officers surrendered to 75 Marines, which is something of an achievement. In Paris, 30 AU found a welter of very useful naval intelligence, wireless transmitters, training centres, radios and radar parts, novel sextants and other equipment, particularly including anti-radar coating for submarines, radar detectors, sea mines and intelligent torpedoes. Indeed, they came across a torpedo arsenal in an underground mushroom farm. Clearly, the men enjoyed their brief sojourn in Paris, to the extent that one particular Marine commented, "I've been trying to find some free French girls, but they all seem to belong to this resistance movement." Into the Low Countries now, and 30 AU moved rapidly up the Channel coast, advancing with the Allies, and they were being directed by Fleming again and were coming across quite a lot of useful bits of kit, and including this submarine, which had been attacked by Allied aircraft and had been damaged on the road, and the 30 AU were sent off to recover it and get it back to the UK. There's not a great deal of information about what these guys got up to while they're heading towards Germany, mainly because they were doing work which was so secret that the information has not become available and not been released to the public and is still held in official archives. So there's not a great deal I can tell you about what they did, other than the fact that we do know that they spent a lot of time investigating V1 and V2 rocket sites until they eventually got up to the German border. So in March 1945, they were spread out into Germany. The main threat now, so far as the Navy was concerned, were the powerful generation of German submarines, the so-called torpedo men, and the midget submarines, and indeed the new hydrogen peroxide power systems for submarines and for torpedoes. So this is what they were looking for when they went into Germany. Once again, there was a new structure, and they now were working on the basis of having 7 teams of 30 men with 8 vehicles apiece. Each team would have a naval officer in charge, a technical officer or an attached scientist, a German-speaking officer from the forward interrogation unit, and a Royal Marine officer or senior NCO in charge of a section of well-armed men, along with a signals section. So into Germany, into Cologne, Patrick Dalzell Job drove his Jeep with a German MG42 mounted on the bonnet, along with his unit into Cologne, where he was surprised to find the citizens very friendly and willing to provide valuable information. They penetrated an engineering works and discovered a suitcase full of information on rockets, guided missiles and jet aircraft, etc. They then crossed the Rhine, entering a turbine factory, new experimental torpedoes powered by hydrogen peroxide, new electric engines for submarines, and details of German technical advances, which were being valuable to the Allies after the war and were filling up their 30 assault unit files. In April 1945, the 30 Assault Unit Team 35 were instructed to investigate a naval headquarters at a place called Bad Sulza. When they arrived at the location, which was a school, they discovered that, in fact, the Germans had fled, and further investigation led them to believe that the Germans' signal unit had moved to a place called Tambach. This turned out to be a very large, rather exotic, as you see on the left, country house, country estate, really, castle in the sense of, not quite to the sense that we would have it, but certainly a very large country estate. They took a very cross-country route, avoiding the German front line, and arrived at the castle to find it was completely undefended. They walked in and surprised the occupants, who immediately raised their hands. The team assembled the staff, which included 2 admirals, who then explained that the castle was the War Historical Document Department of the German Navy, who prepared and stored historical records and papers on naval policy, as well as storing the classified naval records. The library contained a complete operational logs, war diaries, technical reports, and administrative minutes of the German Navy business from 1870 to up to that date. Not enough 30 AU men were available to guard all this, and they were particularly concerned about SS saboteurs, bands of deserters, and the dispossessed, even so-called werewolves. German Navy female clerks called Kriegsmarine Hellführer, led by a large and formidable Frau, started a fire, and they seemed to be more of a problem than the German sailors who were guarding the place. So the ladies were locked up, and the Marines were made very, very clearly instructed that they were not to go anywhere near them. As I say, they enlisted the German sailors, who were very relaxed about the arrival of the Marines, and were themselves concerned about the possibility that the SS might counterattack them. So the Marines got the assistance of the sailors, armed them, and both Marines and German sailors then took up positions guarding the chateau until such time as the Americans could arrive with a relief unit. While they were there, Fleming did turn up, albeit that was towards May of 45, and arranged the shipment of all their findings at the chateau back to the UK. It turns out that there was something in the region of 60,000 files and 500 tons of documentation which had to be shipped back to the UK, and they used a fishery protection vessel and transported all the documentation in beer crates, presumably all that they could get hold of at the time. 26th of April, Team 4 entered Bremen, and ahead of the 30 Corps, their armoured carriers, scout cars, etc., stashed with kit and jerry cans and ammunition, rushed into the city. There was no resistance. Dalzell Job, once again, took 2 scout cars into the Rat House, or the city hall, and captured the mayor, who immediately surrendered the city and assured the Marines that all the authorities would cooperate very, very closely with them, which was good news, because again, there were so few of them that if there had been resistance, the 30A unit would have had difficulty in defending themselves. Once the town hall had been secured, And you can see on the top right-hand side of this photograph the two Humber armoured cars outside the town hall. Then they dashed off to the port, where they discovered a number of partly damaged submarines in the docks, which had actually had their power units, which were hydrogen peroxide, removed, and which they did subsequently discover. And all of this was ultimately shipped back to the UK. Similar group went ahead into Hamburg, where they headed for the docks to discover a mob of displaced persons were breaking into the Navy store, and they had to open fire above their heads with their machine guns to disperse them. Two heavily damaged submarines were lying on the jetty, and again, hydrogen peroxide drives had been removed but were later found. Another unit also went off to Kiel, where again more hydrogen peroxide units were found, and indeed damaged battleships and submarines. I suppose the culmination really of the 30 assault units sojourns in Europe came with the capture and removal of Admiral Karl Dönitz. Karl Dönitz was the replacement, if you like, for Hitler. When Hitler shot himself, Dönitz was nominated to be the new leader of Germany. And for a period of time, the Allies allowed him, even after the armistice on the 8th of May, to continue to have a government and run effectively the unoccupied part of Germany for about 2 weeks. But eventually they decided that he should be taken prisoner. And so a unit of the 30 assault unit were responsible for collecting him and carrying him off to a prisoner of war camp. And these photographs were taken at the time. As you can see, they're part of a British Pathé film. And it's interesting to note, I think, from a purely military vehicle point of view, the Royal Navy using Canadian Chevrolet C-15 TA armoured trucks to transport him to his prisoner of war camp. Moving on to the V rockets, 30AU captured a huge amount of intelligence on the German V1 and V2 rockets and their future development. Very little of their activities relating to the Vengeance weapon program has been released from the archives, no doubt due to the potential sensitivities with our wartime allies. There was obviously the Russians were very keen to capture a lot of this material as well, and the scientists, and there's no doubt that 30AU were very much involved in kidnapping and removing German scientists back to the UK and ultimately to Germany. And this is the sort of thing which the government seems to be keen to keep under wraps and is not making available to historians or the general public. So there's not a great deal I can tell you about the activities other than the fact that we know that 30AU was very much involved in them. So to summarize, what were the achievements and what was the impact of 30AU during the war? Much of the documentation, as I say, remains in the archives, and it's difficult to make a valued assessment of the impact on the outcome of the war and indeed on the peace that followed, or perhaps might be better put on the Cold War that followed. Nevertheless, the intelligence they gathered was hugely beneficial for the scientists in developing countermeasures to the new naval weapons the Germans were developing. Marine radar, as well as conventional radar, benefited from 30AU pinches, and there is no doubt that the information and equipment obtained from raids and pinches the last few months of the war greatly contributed towards the development of future weapons, such as cruise missiles, guided anti-aircraft missiles. For example, the Bloodhound anti-aircraft missile of the 1950s was based on the German design, and ultimately the NASA space program. The Tambach library provided an enormous volume of information about Hitler's Germany, as well as the German Navy secrets, and every kind were discovered. Some were described as the software of the past and the hardware of the future. Much of the Tambach archives are still inaccessible and top secret. From the early amateurish, chaotic first year while operating in the Mediterranean, 30AU quickly learned lessons which led to the professional and highly effective organization it finally became. Involvement and influence of Fleming was there, directing and supporting from behind the scenes. Although not always popular with the officers, he gave nasty broadsides to them for taking their own action in Sicily and not keeping him informed about the movement of the Douve radar equipment. So sometimes they had a view that he was rather arrogant and aloof. Other ranks, however, saw him as being right with them and providing good equipment and moral support.
be prepared to defend their performance when under bureaucratic attack from higher authority. He was, however, greatly helped by the two DNIs for whom he worked and had their full confidence. Fleming did take the opportunity to visit the unit on operations, but was forbidden, as I said before, from putting himself in any danger of capture. As for the reputation of 30 AU, there were mixed feelings amongst those they encountered at all levels. The Marines gained a reputation for indiscipline, involving in looting of personal property from buildings, but also for their appearance. Perhaps this is well illustrated by an incident that occurred to 30 AU section returning from a reconnaissance and meeting an American point unit head on. The Americans assumed that anyone in front of them was the enemy, so leveled their guns at the Marines and tried to arrest the motley crew in jeeps and lorries. They were wearing non-matching uniforms, Navy badges on khaki battle dress, and carrying American weapons, mainly M1 carbines. When one GI casually called a British officer buddy, a young Marine jumped out of his truck, grabbed the GI by the lapels and growled, "Listen here, buddy. When you speak to a Royal Marine officer, you address him as sir and you stand to attention." It's not surprising that the Americans were somewhat confused if you look at this bunch of scruffs who are indeed part of 30 Assault Unit. The mismatched uniforms, lack of badges, berets on the backs of their heads would certainly indicate a rather undisciplined unit. Indeed, by this time, Fleming had nicknamed the 30 Assault Unit as the Indecent Assault Unit. There was, of course, blood, sweat and tears, but there were also amusing incidents. One I like is the occasion when one young Marine, having moved to a new billet in the UK, one night got legless, completely pissed. Back in his billet, he had to get up in the middle of the night. He groped his way to the lavatory in the dark and was easing springs when surprised by his new but soon-to-be ex-landlady, who asked, "What are you doing in my wardrobe?" I did say, I think at one point, that we would move on to vehicles, and here are some photographs of, again, sort of vehicles that 30 AU were using. Jeeps do tend to predominate. There are the SAS type kit on an airborne type kit on the Jeeps, as well as just normal standard issue Jeeps. There's a nice one here of a Jeep trailer with a, on the left, with the RN registration number on the trailer, which I've not seen before. There's a strange mounting of a machine gun on the bonnet of this Jeep in the middle picture, and there's the 30 AU C15 TA. On the bottom right-hand corner are some of the Sofskin vehicles, and that photograph was taken when they were moved into Littlehampton just before their departure for Normandy. So people have asked me, or one or two people have asked me, what's, did very much come from 30 Assault Unit and Fleming's involvement with naval intelligence in the James Bond books. Well, actually, the 30 AU and particularly his involvement with naval intelligence features quite frequently, although rather indirectly, and some examples here. The Director of Naval Intelligence, Godfrey, his last seagoing appointment was command of the battlecruiser Repulse. From on Her Majesty's Secret Service, outside the entrance to M's home, was the brass ship's bell of a former HMS Repulse, which had been M's final seagoing appointment. So Fleming was using Godfrey's appointment for command of HMS Repulse as part of his personality profile for M. Casino Royale's villain at the baccarat table was a chap called Le Chiffre, which means cipher. Fleming had a plan which was actually not implemented because it didn't need to be, but that he was involved in a plan in Gibraltar to effectively seal up some agents inside a cave, an underground cave, in the event that there was a Spanish or German invasion, and from there they would be sending signals out informing London what was going on. This, in fact, the book From a View to a Kill was very similar to the assassin's hideout in a cave underground, which was elaborately camouflaged. Fleming's attention to detail is reflected in the Casino Royale book, where James Bond tells Vesta that his fastidiousness comes from a habit of taking a lot of trouble over the details. The Russian code-breaking machine Spectre, described in From Russia with Love as having 3 rows of squat keys rather like a typewriter, is a description of an Enigma machine. In Thunderball, there is a reference to a new hexagon explosive, which was the German name for a powerful military explosive which 30AU had captured. Many of James Bond's villains were named after people who Fleming met while he was with the Naval Intelligence Department. Fleming modelled James Bond's fictional boss, M, on his own boss, Admiral Godfrey. So what about 30AU today? 30AU lives on today with numerous books, dedicated websites, reenactor groups, displays at military shows, and perhaps the ultimate accolade, a new unit of the Royal Marines, whose role is to conduct intelligence operations in much the same way as 30AU. It carries the name 30 Commando Information Exploitation Group. And here I've just got some examples of some displays that have taken place at that rather strange place, Beltring. And Rex Cadman very kindly lent his Staghound armoured car for a display that we put on about 30AU some 11 or 12 years ago. Reenactor groups seem to be quite regular now. The one on the left is a British group, and the one in the top right-hand corner is in fact Americans. You can tell that by the badly way they wear their berets. So they need a bit of discipline, I think. Somebody should go over there and sort them out. Down the bottom here, we have the modern 30AU, the Commando Information Exploitation Group. And they've been, I think, in existence for about 10 years now, something like that. So we'd be fair to say that 30AU lives on. And now, stand down, a quick collection of photographs of the activities of 30AU during its 3 years of operations from 1942 to 1945. And indeed, it went on through until 1946 and was closed down and disbanded in January 1946. And in the middle there is a memorial to them, which can be found in Littlehampton today. So that's it.